activities on the road to Bogotá towards the Shift the Power Summit that's happening in Bogotá in December 5th to the 7th. You may be aware that there are a number of different activities that are coming up in the coming weeks of what Shift the Power means in different shapes and forms. I'm Jenny Hodgson. I'm with the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And how we wanted to organize today's call, we've got a few interventions from a few partners and speakers from different parts of the ecosystem, but we really wanted to turn this into a conversation. I think it's a really critically important conversation, and I wanted to say a word about why we think it's an important conversation to have. But maybe, and we're recording this, there is simultaneous translation in Portuguese and Spanish. If you want to access that, I can see that people are still coming in through the door, but I suggest we just get started. So why did we organize this particular conversation? Well, from our side at the Global Fund for Community Foundations, we work with a network of local funds and foundations all around the world who are particularly interested in promoting local giving, community philanthropy, local cultures of giving, and understanding what happens when you mobilize resources, how that strengthens trust within communities, but it also helps communities start to articulate their own power in that they're bringing resources to the table. And often we know in the sort of dominant international philanthropy and development system, we don't often acknowledge what resources already exist on the ground. And we assume that communities have little or nothing even. And so within our network in recent years, we had seen a couple of things. One was community philanthropy partners finding themselves on the front line of responses to floods and extreme weather events and such like, not to mention COVID. So suddenly organizations were having to become experts on these sorts of issues overnight, because these were the organizations that communities turned to. But also that very few of our partners, apart from a very particular subset, some of which are represented on this call, saw themselves as legitimate actors in the climate space. So they were confronting events happening on the ground, but not necessarily thinking that they were climate actors or environmental specialists. And so we started to engage a number of our partners in conversations around this. Do you see the impacts of climate in your community? Are the issues you're working on being affected by climate? Have you been able to access climate funding, and so on? And that led to a number of conversations with a range of partners who are represented on this call. So today we're going to hear from the Monteverde Community Fund in Costa Rica, from FASOL in Mexico, a socio-environmental fund. I'm hoping if she's here, we're going to hear from Alda, from the Tindzila Foundation in Mozambique. And we'll be hearing from Juliana from the Alliance of Southern Funds, of Southern Socioambiental Funds, and from Global Greengrants. And that's quite a configuration of local organizations, a kind of growing networks, and a global network like Global Greengrants Fund. So before we get started, I thought it would be interesting to see who we are in this room through the means of a beautiful Zoom poll. So I hope this works. I did this very late last night, but here are some questions to find out who we are in this room. Wendy, are you able to cut and paste the questions? Thank you. In Spanish and Portuguese, they're in the chat. So if you don't mind responding to which of the following describes you best. Oh, there were two questions that jumped up together. They weren't supposed to do that, but you can answer them both. That's great. Hello, if you're just joining, we're just doing a quick poll to map who's in the room with us today before we jump into the conversation. Wendy, can you put the second question in as well, because they both popped up at the same time? Thank you. Okay, we got about 30 responses so far. Just give it a minute. Okay. That must be Artemisa's cockerel joining us. I'm not sure which one they were voting for, though. Okay, I'm going to end the poll imminently. Just let somebody in. Okay, so of those of you who voted, this is what we look like. Can you see the poll? Yeah. So in terms of the number of you working directly and explicitly on climate justice, so that's a third of you on this call. So that's great. So we've got some specialists, some experts here. My organization doesn't work explicitly or only on climate, but it's starting to affect other issues that I work on. So that's 40% of you. And a smaller group not yet involved in addressing the impacts of climate, but we would like to be prepared to, and then a none of the above in a 4% group. So we've got the kind of mix we were hoping for on this call, which is we should all be talking to each other, right? And then the second question, this climate crisis stuff is very complicated and multi-layered. So understanding the science issue, most of you feel comfortable with that. How best to respond? A good number of you feel equipped on that. The impacts of the climate crisis and how the impacts on vulnerable and marginalized groups, the larger issues to do with the causes of the climate crisis and who are suffering the most, and finally, the international donor practices and commitments made to resources, to grassroots. So that's great. We've got people who are clearly engaged on the issue or who want to be engaged on the issue. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to kick off by turning to Katie from the Monteverde Community Fund in Costa Rica. And actually, this webinar came about out of several conversations. One explicitly was with the Monteverde Community Fund, which was why, in the context of the current rhetoric around grassroots, around donors getting more money to grassroots groups, why are community funds and foundations and other grassroots grant makers not being recognized as critical to this conversation? Before we come to you, Katie, however, I am going to ask Bea to give us from Global Greengrants. Bea, could you share some little data points which I think are important for this conversation, and namely that the high-level rhetoric says if you want to address the climate crisis, you need to get resources to grassroots groups, those working on the front lines of civil society. Bea, can you tell us a bit about what that data actually looks like at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. One thing to say, like, who's tracking the data is always a political act, and how that is actually defined is always challenging. And so in many cases, folks here are probably interested in climate justice, and the data that's being measured is largely around mitigation and adaptation. But the latest figures show that around sort of international funding for climate mitigation has tripled since 2015, since the Paris Agreement was adopted, but still really only constitutes 2% of total funding. And so when we sort of take a little bit of a deeper dive on that, we can see that global commitments to climate funding are rapidly increasing, 25% between 2020 and 2021. But then when we look a little bit more nuanced into actually how is that money tracking, we see that women environmental issues receive less than 0.02% of total funding. It's even less, 0.01 in some measures to 0.03 for Indigenous people. And the same with people with disabilities, who constitute 15% of the global population, yet foundation funding for disability rights represents only 2% of a subsection of that funding. And similarly for youth climate justice, which is sort of 0.76%. So in most cases, less than 1% of that 2%. So we can see it's still really, really small when we're thinking about the intersection of human rights and climate justice. And so definitely a lot more scope for us to influence that. And especially when we're thinking around climate justice versus mitigation, which is looking a little bit more closely at that intersection. I can go on, Jenny, but maybe that's enough.
Brilliant.
For the moment.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure people are going to write in the chat, can you share that data with us at some point? Because it's really powerful stuff, right? The rhetoric is all around the importance of getting resources to climate actors, to local actors, particularly around, advancing this from an equity perspective. And yet the practice is just simply not happening yet in the way that it should. So thank you for that, because it's really important framing for this conversation, and it's not so dissimilar from much of the discourse around the localization agenda too, where big commitments have been made and yet resources are yet to flow. So Katie, let's turn to you. Would you mind telling us a little bit about the Monteverde Community Fund and why you kind of came up with the idea for this particular conversation, why you think it's so important? Because I know we've been discussing it for some time already. Katie, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for supporting this idea of having this conversation, and to be for that really interesting data. So why did we initiate this conversation? Our experience is that the Green Climate Fund and other climate resources are not getting to the grassroots, where most of the innovative climate action is happening. And at the same time, community funds and other grassroots organizations are really the best channels to distribute those resources. The Monteverde Commission for Resilience to Climate Change, or CORCLIMA, which I coordinate under the care of the Monteverde Community Fund, started in 2016 as a public-private organization, not only under the community fund, but under the local municipality. And in the early years, we spent a lot of time applying for funds, and international organizations had extremely time-consuming application processes, and we never got funding. It was a waste of time. And in contrast, local sources, which had simpler applications and gave less money, were much easier to access and much friendlier. A year ago, the director of the Global Center for Adaptation visited us in Monteverde, and I suggested to him the idea that resources be distributed through community funds. And he seemed open to the idea, so I tried to set up a meeting with Jenny, and he did not respond. So it is going to take an organized network of local organizations to speak clearly and loudly to the COP. So I'm really glad that Laura is going there and can be a link there, and to other global centers, so that we shift the resources to the local communities and the grassroots organizations. So what does climate action look like? It's different in every community, depending upon their vulnerabilities and their particular situation. I'm going to share 3 examples from Monteverde, and each action reduces greenhouse gas pollution, but also responds to the needs of local people. In each of them, they also help build equity and build community. We have found that strong communities are more resilient communities, regardless of whatever crisis it is, COVID, climate change, whatever. So the first example, sidewalks. 63% of our emissions in Monteverde come from mufflers, from transportation. And at the same time, 1/3 of our population does not have access to transportation. So in our context, sidewalks enable people to walk safely and get exercise and encounter each other, encounter their neighbors and interact with each other, which in turn builds community. And we've decorated them with mosaics of endangered species from the local area. CORCLIMA and the Community Fund together have worked to coordinate the funding from local businesses, local individuals, and local and national government for these sidewalks. And people love them. A second example, eco toilets. 3% of our emissions come from wastewater, 2% come from synthetic fertilizers. 28% of our potable water in Costa Rica is being flushed down toilets, while we have much longer dry seasons when water is becoming scarce and needs to be rationed. So dry composting toilets solve all of these problems. And another local organization here, Bosque Eterno S.A. has funded the prototyping of several toilets, dry toilets, different kinds that are functioning well here in Monteverde. And we have applied to the Expertise France to start a public-private enterprise to manage dry toilets and other water management systems. We had 10 days to write a 40-hour application. It was extremely detailed and complicated. Ricardo's nodding his head because he was very involved in helping figure out all the details of it. And they have written back to us repeatedly telling us that they're going to delay their response. So while we rushed, they're slow. And today, 2 of our team are in the border town of Los Chiles, next to Nicaragua, where there are 3,000 migrants going through every single day without enough toilets, with toilets that are stressed. And it is the local organizations there that are requesting this help from us and that definitely need support in funding and installing dry toilets to prevent a health crisis there. The last example is La Tilichera, which is our bartering center and upcycling center, which we started during the pandemic and continues to thrive. 7% of our emissions come from solid waste, and globally 10% come from fast fashion. And at La Tili, local people can come and exchange what they no longer need for what they do need. 90% of our clients are women. It is completely run by women. A local bank provides the space. The municipality is paying for the electricity and the water. Other donors are currently paying for the women's staff, but our upcycling center gradually is producing more with the hope that it will be able to support the bartering center. We applied for funds from the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, but they were overwhelmed with proposals and we did not receive funding. And it's just evident that there is not enough funding for local initiatives on climate.
Thank you so much, Katie. So Monteverde is a locally based community fund, did some extraordinary work during COVID, introducing this whole bartering economy in the local community. Katie's talked about the sort of the work that the fund does in terms of building community cohesion and trust. And this issue of how hard it is to access this kind of funding. And Monteverde Community Fund isn't the first organization in our network, certainly, that we've spoken to saying you basically need a PhD in environmental economics to be able to apply for this kind of money. It's slow, it's very demanding, and then there's no response, or they take their time. And then the comment around actually, but COP is happening at the same time as the Shift the Power Summit in Bogotá. And sometimes these high-level conferences and grassroots action can seem so far apart. So I want to turn now to Juliana, who's going to tell us about the Alliance of Funds that she helps coordinate, which is really trying to sort of weave together that kind of community-based action, but to build this more collective voice and influence. Juliana, could you say a little bit about the Alliance and this, building on anything that Katie said, or where you see the Alliance fitting into this ecosystem and the particular gap that you are trying to fill?
Hi, hello, thank you, Jenny. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Juliana. I am Brazilian, and I currently coordinate the Socioambiental funds of the Global South Alliance, also known as Alianza Fondos del Sur, Alianza Socioambiental Fondos del Sur. And the Alliance is a pioneer and innovative collaboration between socio-environmental funds of the Global South, practicing community philanthropy, focus on climate justice and on the socio-environmentalist agenda more broadly. We have representatives from the Alliance here in the call today, the FASOL, represented by Artemisa, and maybe Tindzila by Alda, and I guess they will be speaking as well, bringing their own examples. The idea behind the Alliance is precisely to form a group of like-minded funds that have been historically operating in the Global South, or that have been recently created to do so, focusing on climate justice and the socio-environmentalism agenda, and together as a means of collaboration, knowledge exchange, and also in the shape of an alliance that advocates for a new approach, a different approach towards that agenda, which is precisely the narrative I understand we now as a group are trying to push forward and move forward. So when Jenny asked me to speak a few words about this reflection, the first thing that came into my mind, and that's very specific with being Brazilian, because I think it fits a lot with the history of how this term emerged in Brazil, is the fact that I now had the opportunity to speak about the Alliance in international forums, and I realized how much better the Alliance name sounds in Spanish than in English. And I think that's because the term socio-environmentalism is not so widely spread in the English language as it would be in Portuguese and Spanish. So I went back to reflect a bit on this, and it's quite curious and intriguing to see how the socio-environmentalism movement already encompassed crucial notions for the climate justice debate, and how the political leaders and environmental advocates were pioneers in this conceptualization, were contemplating very clearly the intersection between biodiversity preservation and the safeguarding of ecological processes in general, which we now translate into carbon metrics, decarbonization, and all those, this bigger conversation, and the social and the human rights agenda. So looking back, and I'm briefly going back to the late 80s here. So when we first conceptualized sustainable development, when the UN released the first report that conceptualized sustainable development, and meanwhile, in Brazil, we were experiencing our redemocratization process. And interesting to see how that was a period which allowed for the expansion of civil society involvement in the politics of the country, which also meant that environmental movement and the social movement were able to, again, have a dialogue and have an influence in the politics of the country. And then socio-environmentalism emerged as this notion, as this fusion of environmental and social sustainability, but champion values like social justice and equity. And then at the end of the 80s, 88, I guess more precisely, Brazil and the world watched the murder of Chico Mendes, which was a leader, a political leader, and a rubber tapper activist who was tragically assassinated due to his work on defense of the Amazon forest. And the reason why I mentioned Chico Mendes is just to briefly give an example of how that has been somehow a leader that helped thinking and framing this conversation, because among other things, Chico Mendes was murdered being an environmental defender, but he was also defending a very specific economic vision of rubber tapping and other economic activities in the region. And he was the designer behind a very, very pioneer idea that until today is a very crucial public policy in Brazil for forest conservation, which we call extractivist reserve. But by extractivist, we don't mean the negative connotation of extractivist, but a unit of forest that is meant to be preserved by the state of Brazil, but where the traditional and local communities have the right to exert the economic activities that they have historically done in the past, which is a way to allow them to have their social well-being safeguarded while also being the motors, the drivers of the forest protection in that specific region. So I think that the core idea of the message that I want to pass here with this is that in countries where we experience significant poverty, social inequalities, where there are marginalized communities, the term socio-environmentalism serves the purpose of safeguarding nature and climate, protecting species, ecosystems, and all the ecological processes, while simultaneously taking into account poverty, social inequalities, well-being, and multiple human rights dimension. So it's interesting to see that the narrative that we are now reflecting upon today has many historic roots, and it's also interesting to explain a little why we are socio-environmental funds of the Global South. I think that brings back a lot of that and their reasoning. And just wanted to share this as a means for us to reflect what will be the ideal narratives moving forward in this debate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juliana. And I have to say hello to Maria Amalia, who I see joining on the screen with Juan Camilo, who is one of the visionaries behind the idea of a network of socio-environmental funds. And I'm really glad to see you here. But I think, Juliana, in a sense, you kind of help move us on in this conversation. There we go. Spotlight on our colleagues. Lovely to see you. We hope that you'll join in the conversation at some point, but really good to have you here. But this, you know, it is actually the language of climate action and the environment. And, you know, as Bea said, the sort of adaptation, mitigation, the sort of the chilly, almost bureaucratic, technocratic way of looking at it, where Juliana is saying actually the essence of this is work that has come from a deep place of a historic experience of an insistence on the convergence of nature and climate on the one hand, and people and their rights, their dignity, issues of equity, livelihoods, all of those things on the other. And that actually, for many of you who filled in that middle slot on the call saying, I'm not a climate actor, but the things I'm working on actually are being impacted by the climate. It is this insistence that these things do indeed converge with us, converge with each other. And it's foolish to think that they operate in isolation from each other. And the idea, Juliana, that you sort of propose is actually, isn't there a better narrative that would be more all-encompassing and that would speak to the complexity and the integrated approaches of many civil society actors who respond to the needs on the ground of the community and don't live in categories and silos. So I think it really does help open up a creative way to build a bigger us in a very, very constructive way. I'm going to ask Artemisa if she and her cockerel will join us. Artemisa always has a chicken or a cockerel in the background of her calls. I hope he's going to join us today.
Hi, Jenny.
Artemisa, are you there? Can you hear me okay?
Jenny, aquí estoy.
Good, good. So Artemisa, you have been doing this work.
Aquí estoy.
Good, good. You've been doing this work for a long time as FASOL, as a socio-environmental fund. And I wonder if but you're also a fund that does a lot of work on thinking about the importance of community philanthropy and community assets. One of the things that always strikes me about your work at FASOL is that you reject the term that you are an intermediary. And I wonder if you could talk about the work that you do. You are always so careful in the language that you use in terms of power with, power over, and the role of the fund in supporting grassroots groups. So I wonder if you could reflect on this conversation around, you know, how do we, what's the role that FASOL plays in the ecosystem and the possibilities you see for directing more resources to communities from what you've seen, while also preserving the importance of your connection to community. Artemisa.
Muchas gracias, Jenny. Y si está bien, quisiera hablar en español. para que me pierda lo menos posible con mis ideas. Si lo hago en inglés va a ser más complicado. Bueno, hola a todas y todos. Me da muchísimo gusto estar en esta conversación. Es algo que me emociona mucho en este camino a Bogotá. Bueno, lo primero que quisiera comentar es, quiero resaltar los datos que da Vi sobre el porcentaje de los fondos que se están destinando o que se tiene registrado que se destinan a las acciones locales o a las acciones de base. Es realmente sorprendente, pero mi gran pregunta es, hay todo un discurso sobre millones, la danza de los millones, ¿y a dónde van a dar? ¿Quiénes son quienes reciben esos fondos si no los estamos recibiendo para la acción local? Entonces eso me parece una pregunta que aún no tengo respuesta para ello, ¿sí? Y que me encantaría saberlo porque entonces solo me hace pensar si no nosotros, si se queda todo en el discurso y entonces hacia dónde se canalizan. Y está un poco relacionado con esa pregunta que haces sobre ser intermediarios o no, Jenny. Nosotros desde que iniciamos a operar como un fondo mexicano, eh, estábamos ciertos y convencidos que no somos un intermediario de recursos. Y esto es algo que hemos conversado muchísimo dentro de la Alianza Socioambiental de Fondos del Sur. Nosotros somos parte de todo un movimiento, ¿sí? De hecho, si nos ponemos a ver quiénes somos parte de estos fondos, somos activistas desde hace muchos años que buscamos y promovemos la justicia socioambiental. Entonces, es difícil pensar en que somos solamente un intermediario al haber establecido un instrumento de dispersión de recursos como este. Nosotros, por supuesto que estamos muy vinculados a las bases, a las comunidades y al trabajo que se hace desde lo local. Y no nada más en Fasol, sino todos estos fondos locales que somos parte de la Alianza y muchos otros que quizás no sean parte de la Alianza en este momento, pero que hacen mucho trabajo local, como pueden ser las fundaciones comunitarias u otro tipo de fondos, como los fondos feministas, ¿sí? Entonces, yo creo que ahí también es importante que nosotros podamos hacer patente que no somos un intermediario, que somos un actor más de un movimiento que cada vez es más amplio y que busca promover la justicia, la equidad, abatir la desigualdad y estas dinámicas de poder que existen. ¿Sí? Ahora, respecto al trabajo que en Fasol concretamente hacemos alrededor de la filantropía comunitaria, en Fasol desde hace muchos años tenemos un interés muy particular en promover la práctica de la filantropía comunitaria. Lo primero fue entender a cabalidad realmente qué es la filantropía comunitaria, si nosotros la practicamos o no la practicamos. Bueno, lo que en Fasol hemos entendido es que nosotros solo la promovemos, la filantropía comunitaria. La filantropía comunitaria es una práctica de las comunidades, de las bases, de los colectivos y de las colectivas, ¿sí? Y es una práctica además ancestral. Esto es bien importante que me gustaría poner aquí sobre la mesa. No es una cosa nueva. Nuevo el término y es un término que se acuña en el norte global, que proviene además del otro término o que viene acompañado del otro término que es filantropía, ¿sí? Y son términos que son acuñados en el norte global y que cuando llegan a nosotros, ¿sí? Es decir, bueno, ¿qué es eso? ¿Qué es la filantropía? ¿Qué es la filantropía comunitaria? ¿Sí? Y esta es parte de las enormes reflexiones que nosotros buscamos detonar al menos en México y en la medida de lo posible con algunos actores de la región, particularmente Latinoamérica. Entonces, para nosotros es verdaderamente importante que podamos entender o que tengamos un entendimiento común sobre lo que es la filantropía comunitaria, quiénes la practican, cómo se hace. Yo les puedo mencionar que existen al menos un par de nombres o 3 o 4 nombres de cómo la gente de las comunidades y los grupos lo ven. Son prácticas, en México se llama tequio o mano vuelta, y o en minga se llama, me parece que es en Perú o en otras partes de Sudamérica. Y lo que quiero decir con esto es una práctica de apoyo solidario que existe entre las comunidades y los grupos y los colectivos, ¿sí? Entonces, esta práctica de la filantropía comunitaria realmente está más asociada. Muchísimas gracias, Paola. Ajá. Está mucho más asociada a esa forma de relacionarnos, ¿sí? Con nuestro entorno, con nuestros compañeros en las comunidades, ¿sí? De los grupos de base, de los colectivos, ¿sí? Cómo nosotros podemos tener las bases, a eso me refiero, no los fondos, los grupos, los colectivos tienen un montón de recursos, quizás no todos son financieros, ¿sí? Y que son los que invierten cuando desarrollan algún proyecto. Entonces, esto a nosotros nos ha llevado a, insisto, a reflexionar mucho y a decir, bueno, ¿qué tenemos que hacer? ¿Qué está pasando en México, cuando menos, alrededor de esto? Y nos damos cuenta que somos muchos y muchas quienes estamos interesados en ver qué está sucediendo alrededor de la filantropía comunitaria, cómo es que se practica en México, cómo lo ven las comunidades, ¿sí? Y bueno, de entrada lo que puedo compartirles es que después de este último año de trabajo y de hacer algunos talleres exclusivamente con grupos y comunidades, no reconocen, la gente en las bases no reconoce ni la palabra filantropía, mucho menos la palabra filantropía comunitaria. Pero cuando hablamos del significado de esto y de la importancia que tiene reconocer todos esos recursos con los que contamos para desarrollar nuestros proyectos, entonces la gente pues se da cuenta que pues que tiene todo en sus manos para lograrlo. Yo les puedo dar ejemplos de lo que hemos vivido en Fasol, que nos dicen los grupos, si tú no me das recursos financieros, no importa, yo de todas formas voy a hacer mi proyecto. La diferencia la hace el tiempo en el que lo puedo hacer, ¿sí? Entonces eso nos habla de manera muy fuerte de cuál es la posición que tienen los grupos, las comunidades y los colectivos allá afuera en el trabajo que se hace, ¿sí? Para nosotros, que nos sentimos, así es como yo lo defino, como un articulador realmente. Solo somos articuladores, pero tenemos que articular con los donantes, con los financiadores, con los grupos, con los pares, con los aliados, ¿sí? En donde todas y todos podamos caminar juntos hacia un mismo objetivo. ¿Cuál es ese objetivo? Todos buscamos un mundo más justo, un mundo equitativo, un mundo, ¿cómo se dice? Sustentable, ¿sí? ¿Por qué? Pues porque es la manera de sobrevivir en este planeta. O sea, yo creo que el hecho de que estemos aquí, organizaciones que nos dedicamos a promover la justicia socioambiental, no es una casualidad. La crisis climática, bueno, hoy está haciendo explosión, ¿sí? Pero eso es algo que siempre está presente en las comunidades, en nuestras comunidades, en todo el mundo, ¿sí? En cómo estamos relacionándonos con nuestros recursos, con la naturaleza, cómo estamos relacionándonos entre nosotros mismos. Y creo que eso es muy importante que lo veamos, ¿sí? O sea, no es, decía Juliana hace un rato, no se reconoce fuera de nuestra región, no se reconoce mucho el término socioambiental, ciertamente. Pero creo que en todo este proceso de estar haciendo reflexión y difundir información, también es parte de ello, que podamos compartir con otros qué significa esto. El otro día tuvimos una reunión, la semana pasada, sobre filantropía comunitaria, donde estuvimos muchos colegas de diferentes fondos y fundaciones, y me encantó lo que dijo Fondo Semillas al final. Cerró con algo después de dar una explicación de su trabajo y de su camino, es decir, la filantropía es una filantropía, perdón, es una acción por los derechos humanos, ¿sí? Entonces, para mí fue como una gran revelación, aunque siempre he dicho, Fasol y los fondos del sur, somos unas organizaciones que trabajamos y pugnamos por los derechos humanos. Cuando lo dijeron las colegas del Fondo Semillas, me pareció así como una verdadera revelación, decir, wow, ese es nuestro gran paraguas. Porque si bien nosotros, cuando lo vamos llevando a lo local, decimos, ay, pues son los grupos que trabajan limpiando los esteros, o los grupos instalando baños secos, o los grupos tratando de limpiar las playas, ¿sí? Son acciones que no se ven como algo verdaderamente relevante. Sin embargo, la suma de todas esas acciones son las que verdaderamente, yo creo, pueden hacernos mucho más llevadera esta crisis climática, porque en verdad es una crisis que no está teniendo precedentes. Y si no tenemos cuidado en cómo nos relacionamos, no solo con la naturaleza y con los recursos, cómo los utilizamos, sino entre nosotros mismos, realmente va a ser una situación muy complicada para todas y todos en el mundo. Yo digo, lo que hace un grupo en Sudáfrica me afecta, por supuesto, o lo que no hace. ¿Sí? Entonces, creo que aquí lo que es muy importante también es que seamos capaces de vernos como un gran sistema, ¿sí? Que lo que yo hago les afecta a ustedes, lo que ustedes hagan nos afecta a todos los demás, ¿sí? Entonces, me parece que es bien, bien importante y que tenemos que trabajar indudablemente en una nueva narrativa. ¿Por qué? Porque estamos trabajando con la parte de poder. ¿Qué es el poder? Esto es algo que a mí me llama mucho la atención y que salió en la reunión la semana pasada, es la transferencia del poder. Y yo de verdad me quedé pensando mucho y dije, no, creo que no hay transferencia del poder. Creo que tenemos que reconocer que el poder siempre ha estado en la gente. Eso es lo que hace la diferencia para mí. ¿Sí? El poder no lo tiene ni el que tiene todos los millones de los millones, ni nosotros. El poder lo tiene la gente, está en la gente el poder. Entonces, por eso cuando hablamos del cambio en las dinámicas de poderes, ¿quién tiene el poder? No es transferirlo, no. Yo creo que ahí es donde ha residido el problema, que le hemos dado demasiada importancia y demasiado poder al dinero, ¿sí? Y yo creo que en una situación sin la gente, con los miles de millones, sin la gente y sus múltiples recursos financieros, no financieros, materiales, no materiales, tangibles e intangibles, todo ese dinero no lograría lo que hacen todos los grupos cada día por vivir en mejores condiciones. No sé si con eso doy respuesta, Jenny, pero aquí estoy por cualquier cosa. Gracias. Perdón que me extendí tanto, pero me emociona esto.
Wow. We could just stop here, Artemisa. That was amazing. You know, from your first question of like, well, if there's all this commitment to get money to the global south, who's getting the money? Because it's sure as hell not grassroots organizations or those working with them. But then that thinking around actually, how do we reconceptualize the layers of this system we're in? So Fasol, you know, as Artemisa is saying, we're part of a movement. We're a hub or a node. We're part of a machinery. We're a bulb, a bud on a tree or something like. We have a role that we play to articulate, to mediate. And this isn't just a function or a transaction of moving money, but that Fasol's ability to be effective, it depends on your ability to be connected to community and to have their trust and their relevance. This isn't something you can just wheel in from
Tenemos el bus
outside.
en 10 minutos más o menos.
Sorry. And this whole idea of the circularity, the putting people at the heart of this, but also land and culture, seeing community philanthropy as ancestral practice, that this is, you know, I think you spoke so clearly around the problem and yet the power of language. So much of the discourse in philanthropy is Anglophone, it's in English. As you say, these words start to mean something different away from their original origins, and philanthropy are probably the worst offender, that actually the essence of it is love of humankind, and yet it has come to signify or be signified, symbolized by enormous wealth, often derived from extraction and exploitative behaviors that are not good for the planet. So that idea of actually, how do we open ourselves up to new ways of thinking, new kind of language, and understand, as you said, Artemisa, that communities will do this work with or without, regardless. They're not waiting for permission or for money to start, but money sure as hell would help, the right kind of money at the right kind of time. So that sort of articulation of actually, do we challenge ourselves, not just to see ourselves as having roles in the system, but really to unlock the kind of power that I think Artemisa is talking about, which is power as an abundant resource, that everybody has power, instead of seeing power as a finite resource associated with money only. I'm going to ask Laura to jump in here. Laura is the president of Greengrants, but I first met Laura when she was with Semillas, the Women's Fund in Mexico. And my son always reminds me that we stood on a street in Oaxaca and talked for about an hour when he was really very tired and wanted to go to bed, but we had a lot of the world to put to rights. And Laura, where you're sitting now, you have the experience of building local resources, of building a feminist fund, of, supporting ecosystems of women's groups, feminist groups in Mexico. And yet where you're sitting as Greengrants, I think you do sort of see the possibility of this windfall of philanthropic resources. But how do you see it playing out at the moment and the possibilities here? Because as Artemisa sort of so powerfully described, you want the kind of resources that builds on what's already there. You can't do anything without community. So can you talk a bit from that perspective where you sit right now? Thank you, Laura.
Sure, Jenny. I think that my colleagues have highlighted already the huge inequalities in funding that Bea mentioned, the huge disparities that are happening in the action for human rights and solidarity systems that have been existing for centuries in the global South. The fact that these grassroots movements hold the resources and the power, like Artemisa was saying, but yet there is an enormous gap that is also affecting our ability to support grassroots movements in what they do best. And we know that there are no climate solutions without a social and justice and human rights component to it. My colleagues have already made that reference. Juliana made an excellent connection there with the way that we need to tackle the climate crisis requires us to think in terms of intersectional approaches, human rights, social justice. But we know already, and we know in this space, we're very sure that community foundations are inevitably linked to climate through the work that they do, through the support of communities that are not only affected by climate change, they are also proposing solutions and already acting on them. But so why is it that despite the incredible ability of community foundations to support these efforts, why is it that they are ignored by climate funding and the huge windfall that is happening in financing for climate change? And I think that the answer is twofold. On the part of the climate, the tendencies of the climate funding and the donors and the big philanthropies of climate, they think in different terms. They think in terms of scaling up. They always think in terms of carbon measures, carbon numbers. They don't believe in that climate solutions are actually a million different local solutions. They think that the climate solution requires a resolution from a macro perspective, a systems change that is happening through governments, through policy only, and maybe even also through technology. And on the other side, I think that this disparity and this distance is also because grassroots supporters, community foundations, don't speak that language. They assume that they are not experts because they don't talk in carbon language. And but I also will be critical and probably unpopular in this space by saying that we also have challenges in measuring our work, in measuring and actually building a bridge that is needed. And I'm going to be probably unpopular by saying this too, but I believe that in moments of crisis, women need to enter the system of patriarchy to destroy it. And the same way, we need to enter the space of climate funding to change it. And I don't believe that we will do any systems change in the sector and in how the climate funding is behaving unless we start learning how to bridge that language. And they're not going to come to us the way that we are right now. They're never going to come to us. We need to negotiate better terms, and we need to articulate better, because what is happening already is another reality, which is there's a huge bottleneck happening between the large climate philanthropic commitments that are happening, the $1.7 billion commitment to forest protection given, for example, at the COP26 2 years ago between large climate foundations and governments, to commit this money for forest protection to indigenous communities. There's a huge bottleneck happening, and we are there to solve that bottleneck. But unless we articulate ourselves as a collective and as a group, we are not going to resolve the fact that these large, very large amounts of money will not be able to spread out individually and come like in a rainfall, so for each of us to grab individually what is appropriate or the percentage that is allocated to us, because we need to actually be the ones organizing this space. And I do think there that we have more than just quejas. I don't know how to say that in English. Just complaints, complaining that, oh, the sector is, is terrible. I think actually that we are we are doing a disservice to the power that we hold in collectively advocating for a better space in climate funding. And we haven't done that yet. And I do think that this network, the Shift the Power Network, the Road to Colombia, the network that represents the Global Fund for Community Foundations is a huge resource for us to include into this advocacy that we need to create to negotiate better terms with climate funding. And in order to do that, I do think that we need to measure better, speak their language, not change our values, not change our direction, but actually to be able to have them convinced. We cannot just speak with our lingo. We cannot just speak with the terms that we assume that they're going to understand when we mean what we mean when we say shift the power. We need to speak like their language, but in order to get them to where we are. And I think that that's an invitation for us, perhaps in Colombia, to start organizing that agenda a little bit better. Over to you, Jenny.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was pretty clear. We need to measure better. We need to get into those spaces. We shouldn't just stay, complaining at the edges, but actually be much more joined up and build new kinds of solidarities. I think in civil society, we're so good at falling into our categories. I do this, so I can't go to that conversation, or I don't speak that language, and using our own technical language to create more confusion along the way sometimes. But this idea of like, how do we weave a much thicker weave of like-minded actors? How do we build the trust to work together? And then how do we articulate that in more joined up kinds of ways, I think is critically important. And I think your point, Laura, about a million different local solutions is what's needed, not just a silver bullet, that hunger of many funders to look for simple, scalable solutions that can be delivered by large organizations, when actually it's all the stories that Katie shared, what Artemisa was talking about. It's all of the things that matter in the context where they're happening, which are so powerful. I think, Alda, are you still here? I know you dropped off, and I hope you can come back. I just want to hear from Alda in Mozambique. Are you there, Alda?
Yes.
Oh, good. I lost you for a second. I was scooting around the screen. Do you want to switch your camera? There we go. Great. Alda, I'm coming to you last because we've been sort of hanging on the Never Reach Ready to Eat, the Western side of the world, Latin America, that sort of discourse. But you're in Mozambique with Fondo Tindzila, which is a young institution, but you are by no means new to this discourse. And I'd love to hear what this conversation looks and sounds like to you from your position in Mozambique, and as a member of the Alliance of Socioambiental Funds as well. Alda, over to you.
Obrigada. Posso fazer o mesmo que a Artemisa? Não sei se há tradução para português. Jenny?
Yes, 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 yes.
Yes? Ok. Vou tentar falar calmamente, devagar, para ser perceptível. Então, a minha contribuição é bem curta. Em primeiro lugar, boa tarde, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite a todos. O meu nome é Alda Salomão e eu sou diretora do Fundo Tindzila. Como a Jenny mencionou, é um fundo recentemente criado, em 2020, mas de facto também, como a Jenny mencionou, eu pessoalmente e alguns dos colegas da nossa instituição já, digamos que militamos no campo da advocacia da sociedade civil há alguns anos. Com um foco muito grande na questão da governação de terras e recursos naturais, proteção de direitos à terra, direitos humanos ambientais e etc. Mas mais recentemente começamos a tentar fazer a ligação entre proteger a nossa intervenção na contribuição para a proteção de direitos, com a responsabilidade que também sentimos que tínhamos de criar espaço para aqueles grupos, aquelas comunidades às quais nós estávamos cujos direitos nós estávamos a proteger, elas próprias fossem atores dos processos, não só de advocacia, mas também dos processos de desenvolvimento. Como abrir espaço, criar oportunidades para que o ativismo social, ambiental e econômico seja feito por um leque mais alargado de atores que não sejam só organizações de base urbana, as tais organizações intermediárias de intermediação financeira, que é a posição que muitas de nós ocupamos. Então, as minhas reflexões em relação ao que podemos levar para Bogotá seriam talvez no sentido de nós definirmos um quadro analítico que nos permita discutir a questão da relação de poderes, a questão das alterações que queremos fazer à correlação de poderes. Em primeiro lugar, penso que temos de ter clareza sobre quem são os atores de que estamos a falar. Não é? Nós estamos a falar de uma dinâmica, de uma relação de poderes. Quem são os atores que detêm poderes e que poderes é que esses atores detêm? Então, um quadro que tenha clareza sobre atores, começando nós próprios, estou a falar do setor do ativismo socioambiental, por olharmos para nós próprios e para vermos qual é o papel que nós jogamos e como é que nós asseguramos inclusão antes de olharmos para outros atores, como doadores, como governos, como empresas, etc. Nós próprios, como é que nós estamos organizados? Como é que nós comunicamos uns com outros? Como é que nós nos engajamos e apoiamos mutuamente? Foi mencionada aqui a questão da solidariedade. Nós somos um movimento que estimula a solidariedade, que partilha conhecimento, que partilha oportunidades e que partilha recursos financeiros também. E a pergunta aqui seria, estamos no nível certo de organização e participação e inclusão? Sentimos que temos todas as vozes e todas as caras e todos os interesses representados no setor do ativismo social e ambiental? Falar de atores. Em relação às responsabilidades, também acho que é importante nós analisarmos qual é o papel e quais são as responsabilidades que nós queremos assumir. A Artemisia falou da questão de não queremos ser vistos como apenas ou, sobretudo, intermediários financeiros. Nós somos mais do que isso, nós somos agentes de discussão de modelos e opções de desenvolvimento. Queremos ser parte dos atores que discutem modelos de desenvolvimento. Então, temos a responsabilidade de criar o espaço para que possamos participar nesses debates. E a questão aqui que se coloca é: estamos a esforçar-nos para nós próprios, por iniciativa própria, induzirmos e estimularmos os debates sobre os modelos de desenvolvimento que queremos? A questão dos recursos, que é talvez a terceira dimensão, aparece depois, mas acho que termos clareza sobre atores, termos clareza sobre responsabilidades e papéis, e depois avaliarmos que recursos é que temos ou que precisamos para perseguirmos as nossas diferentes agendas de um modo convergente, é uma sequência que me parece lógica. Então, nesta questão do debate sobre relações de poder, acho que estes elementos nos ajudariam a ter um rumo mais claro e talvez mais fácil de seguir, que nos impeça de ficarmos perdidos, porque o comentário que eu fiz na última conversa que tivemos foi a percepção que temos de que ficamos muitas vezes perdidos em hypes ou em ondas de modas que aparecem e que muitas vezes nos desviam daquilo que é o rumo e que é o foco dos processos que queremos seguir. Dirigindo-me agora à questão do desenvolvimento comunitário, desenvolvimento de base local, com atores locais, em que eles partilham não só responsabilidades, mas partilham também os seus recursos e as suas iniciativas de solidariedade social e económica, portanto, aquilo que nós chamamos de filantropia comunitária, dito de outro modo, é uma estratégia de solidariedade de nível comunitário, que existe e tem várias modalidades. Portanto, como é que nós asseguramos que o desenvolvimento local, o desenvolvimento comunitário, não é perturbado pelas modas que aparecem de tempos a tempos? Hoje discutimos muito, também mencionei mudanças climáticas, e eu perguntava: quem é que está a discutir mudanças climáticas ao nível local? Com quem é que se discutem as estratégias de adaptação, mitigação e resiliência climática? Laura mencionou a questão da imensidão de recursos financeiros que existem e as dificuldades que aqueles que estão no centro dos impactos das mudanças climáticas têm de aceder a esses recursos. Então, a questão de atores, poderes, responsabilidades e recursos, para mim, é uma questão que deve ser levantada, tendo como base o facto de que há um processo de desenvolvimento que tem que ser seguido, desenhado pelas próprias comunidades, com base em conhecimento, percepções, prioridades e interesses que elas próprias definem, e onde a sua agência e a sua capacidade de intervenção é valorizada, né? Então, quando nós nos deixamos levar pelas modas, eu não sei em português como é que se diz hypes, eu digo isso, modas do momento, muitas vezes nós também contribuímos para que o esforço, para que se perca a consistência e a concentração e a coerência nos esforços que são feitos ao nível local para um desenvolvimento consistente. Eu estou a levantar aqui uma série de aspectos soltos, mas que é a minha proposta de como é que nós podemos talvez contribuir para um debate mais ou menos estruturado sobre como queremos abordar as questões de relações de poder entre os diferentes atores com diferentes interesses, diferentes possibilidades, responsabilidades e etc. Então, para terminar, o que eu estou a sugerir é que nós definamos um quadro analítico que nos oriente nas discussões que queremos levar e conduzir em Bogotá e para além de Bogotá. Obrigada.
Thank you so much, Alda. And I think that the caution against following the money and the hype and the fad, when you're pointing out this is the work on the ground. It's not going to be done because funders are going to decide something else matters in a few years' time. So how do we keep our feet firmly on the ground with clear values, be more strategic, more joined up, and understand that, community philanthropy is a less than perfect term, but like, how do we actually populate all of these words with meaning? And you're talking about community-based solidarity, or, it's really, how do we sort of take the resources we've got and say, well, what can we cook up together? So to help answer that question, I'm assuming it's you, Maria Amalia, that wants to chip in, because you've been thinking about this for such a long time, and I'm so delighted to see you on this call. So I hope you'll share. Amalia.
Yes, I always have an opinion.
Of course, and it's welcome.
Thank you. Well,
do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yes,
Yeah.
Amalia Souza. I'm the founder of Casa Socioambiental Fund and one of the founders of the Alianza Socioambiental Fondo del Sur. I'm here in Bogotá with Juan Camilo. That's why it's his name here. We're using his computer. He's the director of Emerger, Fondo Socioambiental Colombia. So one of the members. We are now 10 members. We started, but we're growing pretty fast. We already have other applications. So first thing is an invitation that anybody putting resources in the hands of local communities, because all of the local communities are dealing with climate change. I think this is the first thing we need to realize in the community philanthropy space, is that we are all, in a way, both either affected or affected. All of us are, but are already working. Whatever community work is done, it is about mitigation or adaptation, or it's about fighting the injustice of being the most affected by the climate disasters that are happening. So no matter what, I think this is the first realization that this field, or the wider field of community philanthropy, needs to grasp or begin to use. You could just look around and you will recognize that. So I am obsessed with narratives. and this is one thing we've been trying for more than a decade, right? To get all of our, not silences, because we know each other, we talk to each other, our kind of group definitions. So like community philanthropy, like the women's funds, we are all local initiatives from local actors trying to fill a gap, a huge gap that the Northern or international philanthropy leaves in our countries and our societies. Socio-environmental funds were born because we saw that the guardians of most important biomes in this planet don't have a penny, and they protect it with their lives. We are actually here representing the two, Colombia and Brazil, the two most dangerous places in the world for environmental and territorial defenders. And these people are not going to stop, because there is nothing else they can do but put their lives on the line. All we are doing is to be there with them and resource them. So it is our duty, in my opinion, to understand this language. There is new money for it, money that is not even from philanthropic structures, new money from corporations or wealthy people that decided that climate is the most important issue of our times. They really want to get resources to the hands of local communities, but they end up being blocked. And well, of course, they cannot do it directly. They have to through us, all of us. And I think that is the position. They are understanding this. They just don't understand how to reach us. So this is our job, to let them know. I think this is the job we need to do here together, all of us doing whatever we do, because it's the combination of all of us. It is about cooperation. None of us gonna have the one answer, the bullet, the silver bullet. That doesn't exist, right? It is about putting resources in the hands of the most important people on earth right now, the real guardians of the crucial ecosystems that support life on this planet. It's going to regulate. So these kinds of narratives need to be absorbed and used more often by all of us, linearly. And as Artemisa said, it's not about shifting power. It's about power with. We find resources. We are not the important people because the money is in our hands. People think they are important because they have money. This is an illusion, because without a planet, no money is gonna be worth anything. So the people who are important are the guardians and the protectors and the people who are changing the systems to be more sustainable for all of us. They are the important ones. So it is about power with. It has to be. And all we are doing here is bridging the narrative together. And we need to be many more voices in these spaces, because we know some of us that are acting in what we call socio-environmental fields are beginning to be found by these new structures. They don't know yet exactly how much we are capable of absorbing more resources. So they kind of, they're tiptoeing. They give us a little bit to see how we do with it. But I think that just the existence of this alliance with the $8 million that we got together by this new initiative, the Forest Peoples and Climate, when we were just an idea, really gives a sign that somebody's seeing that the answers are in our hands. 8 million is nothing compared to the 80 million or 100 million that they give to northern-based organizations. But it is a beginning. It's a sign that there is a willingness, and we are the ones that have the job to prove ourselves capable, efficient. That's why we do auditing. That's why we are transparent. That's why we create publications that demonstrate evidence of our efficiency and effectiveness. So this is what we need to do. Without this, they're not going to understand us. It is our job to position ourselves and to take our voices, to push ourselves inside those spaces. And so we have a lot to do. It's not just about putting the money in the right places. We are experts in that. It's now about learning another language. We need to do it together, and really together. None of us alone has that power to change these conversations at that high level. But together we are beginning to make dams. And I think that we have a chance, but we have a chance if we actually align them. So that's what I hope we do from now on.
Thank you so much, Amalia. Yeah, I mean, you sort of laid down the chance. We have a chance here. Are we prepared to get ourselves organized and do what we need to do? Ricardo, I'm going to come to you. Ricardo is the director of the Monteverde Fund, and then I'm going to open up in the last few minutes for other contributions. I can see Mimi from Urgent Action Fund Africa saying, okay, so when and how do we commence this transformational idea? So let's get thinking about this. But Ricardo, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can I intervene in Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I will try to be slow so the interpreter can do their work. Okay, agradecerles a todos por las intervenciones. Creo que desde que hemos estado planeando este espacio ha sido muy inspirador. Y recogiendo un poco la pregunta que hacía Jenny de cuáles podrían ser los próximos pasos, yo creo que ya inclusive hay cierta capacidad instalada con la Alianza Fondos del Sur. Le decía tanto a Keiri como a Janelle que nosotros desde el Fondo Comunitario Monteverde ya queremos establecer contacto y ver cómo podemos formar parte de la Alianza de Fondos Socioambientales del Sur, porque ya es una plataforma que existe y que está trabajando en el tema. Creo que a partir de lo que ya existe, es inclusive hasta más fácil activarnos. Inclusive, pues el trabajo que están haciendo Ágata y Marian del mapeo, creo que también contribuye a identificar actores y demás. Y creería que, digamos, en futuras acciones como bloque, ya sea a través de la Alianza de Fondos del Sur, del mismo Global Fund for Community Foundations, y las plataformas y recursos que tenemos disponibles, hay creo que al menos 3 ejes importantes. Uno es el de incidencia política, precisamente el poder hablar ese lenguaje en los grandes espacios, llámese COP, llámese las grandes fondos ambientales que operan sobre todo en el norte global, que son muy técnicos, etcétera, poder tener ese espacio de incidencia articulado es fundamental. Otro es una rama de proyectos, precisamente compartir esa expertise, esa habilidad de medir, de evaluar, de replicar proyectos que tienen éxito en el territorio, considerando, a diferencia como lo hacen, digamos, los grandes actores, considerando la sabiduría y las particularidades de cada territorio. Creo que eso es importante, y el hecho de que seamos, por decirlo así, de los mismos, creo que lo hace más fácil. Y otra es el intercambio entre pares. Creo que esa cooperación sur-sur que puede surgir en estos espacios es fundamental precisamente por lo mismo, porque si bien cada territorio tiene sus particularidades, tenemos afinidades y un lenguaje común. Entonces, a partir de ahí es mucho más sencillo, más fluido realizar este trabajo. Y reforzando un poco lo que decían anteriormente, el tema hasta de seguridad, porque el ser defensor de la tierra, defensor de la naturaleza, como bien mencionaban, es una de las labores más peligrosas en América Latina. No sé en otras latitudes, pero hasta ese tipo de temas tienen que estar en la mesa y en agenda, porque hay mucha gente que literal pone el cuerpo para proteger, pues, los sistemas de vida que nos sostienen, ¿verdad? Entonces, creería que son como esas vertientes. Lograr una plataforma donde haya economía compartida, donde compartamos conocimiento, expertise, etcétera, creo que son parte de los próximos pasos a tomar. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Anyone else in the last few minutes want to chip in? Mary Rose, I can see you've put a comment in the chat. Barbara too, and various people have, quite a lot of comments in the chat. Anyone want to jump in with yeah, Mary Rose, over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mary Rose Murphy. I'm with the Haiti Community Foundation. And in Haiti being one of the most at-risk countries when it comes to climate change. And we've been dealing with it, and there are people that may not know the term and the technicalities, but they are not sleeping so that they can pump water and try to deal with the drought. So I just want to stress, because there's a part of me that is tired of constantly being put in a position where we local organizations, we global South people have to explain ourselves, prove ourselves, document, measure, and everything else, while we're the ones who are dealing with these issues at the forefront, whose communities are dying and starving because of these issues, or having to immigrate and all of these things. And I am not saying that we should not document, that we should not be technical or whatever else, but I think we have to be careful about our attitude. And this is where collective action is necessary. And because I also feel like this is sort of like a standard, it's a standard dynamic in terms of and strategy when it comes to the global policies. It's like, oh, well, are you qualified? Are you qualified to work on your own countries and what you're dealing with, your own communities? So I really feel like also, there's going to be a collective, because we're talking about hundreds of millions and billions, but the stakes are high. And if people really get their act together and we put ourselves together, we frankly should not settle for a little bit and for crumbs. I'm tired of getting bones. I think when the issues are literally sort of like at leading us to self-destruction. And we're still talking about power and control. I'm sorry, Jenny, you know me and my, I'll just put things on the table, but it's like, let's get real. There are also issues in terms of, we want to talk about racism, we want to talk about colonialism, we want to talk about all of this, They're all there. Everybody's being polite, but this is what's that. And there are people that are willing. There are different people at different parts of the spectrum, but these are some of the issues that we have to deal with. So yes, okay, I'll document, I'll report. I've gotten very good at that for decades. For the decades I've been working on all of this. But you know what? There are barriers that we have to be aware of. And this is why we need to build collective action. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Rose. Hey, I don't think anyone would disagree with you, right? And I think that sense that so many organizations feel like they've been working in isolation. So like, if we know that we've got allies and colleagues who have the technical expertise, then we don't all need to be experts, and we need people to be angry. We need people to be strategic. That's how this will work. And Mimi suggested in the chat, we could start a network and a movement towards more collective action. We should be talking more to each other. Actually, we all operate in a competitive system, which doesn't facilitate trust building all the time. If I think I'm going to get something and you're not, well, I'm not going to share my secrets with you because you might get the money and I might not. So I think all of these things, to put them on the table, but I think the conversation really starts here with actually, what are we prepared to do to unlock this abundance of knowledge, of proximity to communities, of being able to, you know, the networks represented on this and the organizations represented on this call already show that actually the reach into community is very deep. How do we agree to do business with each other differently? I don't know if any of the starting speakers want to say a final word. No need to go around the whole group, but if anyone has any thought in terms particularly about next steps. We've got the Shift the Power Summit happening in Bogotá. It will be at the same time as COP. Is there a collective message that we want to kind of get coming from Bogotá that could land in COP? Could we organize ourselves to drop some key messages? Any final thoughts from any of the opening speakers or anyone else at this point in the last few minutes? Laura.
This has been...
Oh, Laura, and then I'll come to you, Katie.
Gracias, Jenny. I'm gonna speak in Spanish.
Go, great.
Sí, voy a hablar en español porque creo que esto realmente quiero que les llegue como a, no sé realmente cómo sea el panorama en otras regiones, pero como a gente de Latinoamérica. Y voy a intentar hablar lento. Pero creo que también, bueno, me presento. Yo soy Laura, hago parte del Youth Climate Justice Fund, que es un fondo participativo de jóvenes para jóvenes que buscan como apoyar proyectos liderados como por comunidades, por jóvenes que estén trabajando como en la justicia social, socioambiental o climática. Y pues es un grupo internacional y yo soy de Colombia y mi familia es de Bogotá, Boyacá, de una comunidad campesina nativa. Y como que ver todo esto como que es más como como que también necesidad de reflexión y autocrítica, que creo que sí es necesario hacer como latinos. En mi cabeza como que yo diferencio un poquito las regiones de Latinoamérica y Abya-Yala. Para mí Latinoamérica es como esta identidad latinoamericana que nos pusieron como los europeos, que es súper occidentalizada, y luego sí está más como la Abya-Yala, la territorial, que es la de los pueblos nativos, originarios, indígenas, y para mí siento que muchos de estos espacios igual están súper ocupados como por gente más latina, como que muchísimo más como blanqueada, y como que aunque sí es, o sea, como que yo participando en esos espacios, uno, me siento sola dentro de mi identidad latina un poquito, pero me siento aún más sola dentro de mi identidad siendo parte de una comunidad campesina nativa. Entonces como que creo que sí, igual hace falta la reflexión de como que hay nortes y sures dentro de los países del sur y como no seguir motivando o como replicando esas prácticas internacionales dentro de las regiones y como motivar más bien que personas mismas de las comunidades que les atraviesan directamente los impactos y como las desigualdades que hay participen directamente y como que seamos también nosotros quienes llevemos el dinero a nuestras propias comunidades. Porque pues sí, yo lo digo porque yo pues tengo, digamos, el privilegio un poquito de estar acá también porque mis papás migraron de Bogotá a Bogotá y pues yo crecí en la ciudad, en la capital. pero si no hubiese sido por eso, estaría como el resto de mi familia súper desconectada de esto, y con total desconocimiento de todo este dinero que se mueve descomunal en estos espacios. Entonces sí, pues ya, eso era todo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Laura. Really important, you know, that it's not just north-south power, it's power differentials within countries and communities as well. And I'm really glad you were able to join us today. I'm going to turn to Katie, and then Juliana, I'm going to give you the last word. So Katie, over to you.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'm really inspired, and this really gives me hope. And I think everybody needs hope in the face of climate change. And I really appreciate all the comments that have been made. I really think that our role is to articulate that what's the translation for that in English? Articular. It's to join. We're connecting people within our communities, and we are connecting between each other. And I love the idea of how we each have different skills that we can share. I'm really excited that Laura is going to COP, and hope that perhaps even before we get to Bogotá, we can begin to discuss a little bit more. What is the message that we want to take to COP? How can we have a draft, perhaps, that then we could further discuss, that we could then have Laura share at the COP. So thank you all. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie. Juliana, last word.
Wow, last words. Well, I did promise to Jenny I was going to somehow make them open arms, as we say in Portuguese, for the Alliance to also be a platform, a space, and to be partner in this whole movement. I think being a focus on climate justice and the global south, I think it's the space that was designed and idealized for those kind of conversations and moving forward action to take place, regardless of members or not members, and in partnerships with all the organizations here. We will also be at COP representing and supporting Laura in this, and hopefully making the link with the Shift to Power event. I think it's another important conversation to have. And as a final reflection, what I see, and I think it's really interesting to hear again Laura, who I've had the pleasure to meet recently in other events from the youth climate movement speak. And I think what she brings is the level of nuance that our movement gathers, because we're here looking at decolonial perspectives of the world, trying to reimagine a new narrative for things that have been there for a long time, and they're very, very powerful in narrative speaking. In terms of a narrative, those are the powerful narratives and how we envision the world. And anything different from that will take a lot of collective efforts and a lot of designing and thinking and reflecting together. And the other side, if we can put like this, the other side has very clear, effective, objective messages, while we have a lot of diversity to take into account. So it is more work and it demands more of us, but happy to be part. I guess those would be my final words.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you everyone for joining today. I mean, I hope we can leave feeling like actually we do have what we need to have what it takes to make what we need to do this. Actually, the networks, the individuals, the organizations, the diversity, the connectedness, and that the ability to kind of build our networks, to choose to come to show up together, to experiment together, to trust each other and not just to see difference. So I have to go into that room because I do climate, you go into that room because you do this. Actually, I think the framing for this conversation, this is about people, this is about planet, this is about some core shared values of the world we want to live in, really is something that binds us together, as well as being strategic and tactical at the same time. So I love the idea of thinking, well, what is a message we could take to COP? We will share the recording of this with everyone who subscribed, and we'll also, as part of that, invite people who want to be involved in thinking some of this through about how do we model networked ecosystem approaches, because when we start joining forces, we are many more than we sometimes feel like we are. And I think that the final point of actually this is a matter of life and death for many of those environmental activists on the front lines of this work. And so it's not even a luxury that we have to think, are we going to do it or not? This is life and death work. And I think remembering the people who do the work and thinking, how can we best be in service of those people and the families and networks and communities they're from. But for today, this was just a warm-up for a conversation, and I hope we can continue to take it forward and we can all travel on this journey together, whether you're on Bogotá or not in person. I hope you'll be there in spirit at least, and on this longer journey together. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and yeah, take care.